Okay, so hi again, everyone. We are very happy and delighted to host Dr. Omar Sabbagh with us tonight. A face and voice and pen that you all know, most of you at least. Dr. Omar Sabbagh is one of our contributing editors to Indelible, and he's been a poet and a writer for such a very long time. Um, Ahmad Sabbagh is actually a widely published poet, writer, and critic. Over the last decade and a half, his poetry has appeared in many prestigious venues, such as Poetry Review, PN Review, Agenda, Acumen, New Humanist, New Writing, The Reader Magazine, Stand, Kenyan Review, New England Review, Banipal, The Warwick Review, The Wolf, among many others. His first collection and his fourth collection are, respectively, My Only Ever Oedipal Complaint and To the Middle of Love. His fifth collection, but it was an important failure, that's the title of the collection, was published with Cinnamon Press near the start of 2020. His Beirut novella Via Negativa, A Parable of Exile, was published with Licorice Fish Books in March 2016, and he has published much short fiction, some of it prize-winning. A study of the oeuvre of Professor Fiona Sampson, Reading Fiona Sampson, A Study in Contemporary Poetry and Poetics, was published with Anthem Press in 2021 and was released in revised paperback edition in 2020. His Dubai novella, Minutes from the Miracle City, was published with Fairlight Books in July 2019. Morning Lit, Portals After Alia, was published with Cinnamon Press in early 2022. His book of Lebanese verse narratives, The Cedar Never Dies, is now published with Northside Press, March 2023. And a collection of his published short fictions, Why Nots, is to be published with Licorice Fish in autumn of 2023. He has published scholarly essays along with much literary journalism on George Eliot, Ford Madox Ford, Henry Miller, Lawrence Durrell, George Steiner, G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, Lytton Strachey, T.S. Eliot, among others. He holds a BA in PPE from Oxford, 3 MAs, all from University of London, in English literature, creative and life writing, and philosophy, and a PhD in English literature from KCL. He was visiting assistant professor of English and creative writing at the American University of Beirut from 2011 to 2013. Presently, he teaches at the American University in Dubai, where he is associate professor of English. And without further ado, Ahmad, I will give you a moment with your new book, straight off the press.
Thank you, Rilla, so much for that. And thank you for hosting me tonight with Indelible Evenings. It's a real privilege, and I'm very, very appreciative and grateful. So, I mean, I was thinking, can everyone hear me first? Is everyone like, is it working, yeah? Yes, good.
We can hear you.
I was thinking, yeah, I'll just give you a quick background about the nature of the book. And then what I was planning to do was to read for about 25 minutes, 4 or 5 chapters from across the book. And then we can, and if anyone has any questions or comments, we can do that at the end. Yeah. So what happened was, about 2 years ago, nearly, Christopher Jackson, who's a poet and an editor, works professionally as an editor, but also now just started up this new publishing house, Northside Press, wanted a Lebanese book from me because he knew I was Lebanese and I had an angle on things and so on. I wanted to write a novel in prose, and he objected because he doesn't like my prose. He thinks it's mannered and wordy, which it can be seen to be, but I have arguments that would support my prose. But anyway, I agreed to write the thing in verse. And it was going to start off being a verse novel, you know, like a unified narrative with certain characters, minor, major, and so on, like any other novel. But as I began to kind of do a bit of research and interview people, I realized it was much better to try and because I don't have the experience myself, I never lived in Lebanon for a long period of time. And my knowledge was not very deep at all, and still isn't very deep about Lebanon. I was more of a host, like a documentary to different people's stories and the research I did. So it ended up being a poetry collection of verse narratives split into three parts. The first part is titled The World's Envy, and I'll give you a bit of an introduction to that in a minute. The second part is called War-Torn Tales, which has stories from the Civil War and beyond. And the last part is just some kind of individual portraits or like characters. And so it's a collection of poetry, of verse narratives treating of modern and contemporary Lebanon, which kind of coheres as a collection, but not as one unified narrative. And apart from reading some iconic books, the ones I was advised to read, like, you know, Pity the Nation or Fawaz Trabulsi's book, or Salibi's book. I read a few books which I recommend to you, which are brilliant books, gave me some background info. Primarily, I interviewed people who I knew a hell of a lot more personally and kind of academically than me about Lebanon. And I use that material to build up these chapters, and it becomes, you know, a verse narrative collection. So what I was thinking of doing is I'm going to read, in the first part, there's a literary device is made use of. You have a father figure talking to his son, telling him about Lebanon, right? And that device is primarily used in part one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first two chapters, which are not really to do with the content so much of Lebanese stories as setting up the literary device. Then I'll read another chapter from that first section. I'll give you the titles of each one as I go along. And then I'll read one chapter from War-Torn Tales, which are which is like the meat of the book. The majority of the tales are about, you know, suffering and war-torn tales in Lebanon. And then I'll read the epilogue. The epilogue is about the 2020 explosion. As we all know, that is kind of the epilogue of Lebanon as well. So I'll read about, probably in the end, 5 chapters. It won't take long. It's not prose. It's sparsely populated pages. So forgive me, I'm whiskey and cigarettes because it helps. Right, so let me start off with the first chapter, which is titled The Patriot. The second chapter, which follows, is called Mourning Becomes the Law. And that's in the wake of the context of that is the wake of Hariri's assassination. And then the next chapter I'll read from later in that section is called In Hariri's Wake, because I think it'll be like, you know, it'll kind of be context-wise easier to follow. And then I'm going to read one story from War-Torn Tales in the epilogue. So let me start with The Patriot, if everyone is following me. So this chapter is just getting in the literary device, as it were. The Patriot. Oh, I should say part one, as I think I may have mentioned, is titled The World's Envy, and ends on a chapter about the Lebanon once upon a time being the world's envy. So let me start with The Patriot. The Patriot. Here's the age of the aging man, and here a long man span of time, the cells that percolate the skin of 2 clapping hands, a life of meriting. The man is quietly dying. And so, like a final battle inside his head, or like a mind at work inside the same, I listen to the tales he has to tell. Like a dying son, though still alive, one hopes, for long to come. Dear boy, there is one sole thing in this poor life worth living for or with, and with a true and hard and hammered grip grasping, and with a bold mouth and with a bolder lip, whatever fate may deal you. Character, and that is all, and that is it. Money comes and money goes, but the quality of a man's darling soul takes him places far beyond the moot and scuffling point of a mortal life merely, in life's moot grey raffle. Character, it is everything. By its gold coin you may decipher the truth in every nook and cranny. You will see with an artful eye the nature of the cornicing by which the good-limbed rules of any life speak out to the sky above. Character, it is everything. And for a man like me, born in a time that was long and far from anything like a cage, all things like a flux and up for grabs, There was only ever one true thing with which to search the truth of things, one's country, nation. In this small, sad notion, you will find the key and clue and a purpose pointing like an arrow through each moment of your dying. I lived for myself, for my family, true, but I gave what I could and went to the needs of a surging nation, be it now a nation that reads its writ, its telling tale, in this, the telltale of its nearing place of death. Listen close. I want to speak to you of how my life was spent between two straits, that of the sea's long wide blue and that of the skies, just as true. And when I tell you, oh no, what happened? What happened? Hello? What
We can
happened?
still hear you.
Can
Nothing
Can you
happened
see
here.
me?
We
Yeah.
can hear you.
Sorry, can you?
Yeah, we
I
can.
can't see myself. Okay, good, I'll continue. And when I tell you, and to your eye, can you see me, yeah?
We do.
Oh, sorry,
Mhm.
something went wrong with my, anyway, okay. And when I tell you and to your eyes that this was true, that this was not, believe me. For I'm a man untying the gray and twisting fibers of his life's last reed, his last gray knot. And so I listened, the brow that bore my eyes inside their deep set peep, keen but somehow mellow still. I listened most of all for myself. It was always a fear, you see, that I was like the apple that fell, but fell a furlong far from the noblest of darling apple trees. I knew so little to then about the lore or about the lived felt history of this fertile land of fertile people. And here I told myself and told him well, my sire was siring himself, was signing the page of a life with his last name signed, his final loop of grace. And naturally, I yearned to be the flesh to meet the face, an earthen fruit peering upwards at the light, its hungry song of wishes, picketing the sky, naked and white. I wished to be summed in short, the equal to all of this, the tale of what had made him the brilliant father of all my beginnings. So I listened with a tethered ear, lessening and lessening in illicit fear, the more he spoke of this strange, glad place in which a young man had found his space, time. Like most sons, my first wish, the way I was socketed, primed to wish, was to feel balanced by the scale of his pleasure, was to feel the surety of a sure-felt rhyme to him, his eyes, here, at close to the end of his burning, beating line. A line ending just like this at the end of the line, in the poem of a life that went kissed like a poem's lines, a poem from one who'd feared he'd missed the chance to be the same. Verse, if you like, whose wheels speak to a universe of failing, where I was slow, or like a slows coach doing his best to meet the pace and track the track of the passing hearse, by way of rapture, the passages of a telltale past. Lines so long and soon set to line and line a journey, whose utter root of betterment I can only wish for. So I turned to my father and said, so be it, Dad, amen. Just tell me more. That's the first chapter. Can you hear me, everyone? Quickly. Sorry, I just want to check.
Yes, we can. Mhm.
Okay. Chapter 2. Mourning becomes the law, as in mourning, as in not good morning, as in mourning, as in grieving. So, and in brackets 2005. He looked at me and saw I meant to hear it all. Listen, son, listen to the sound of grief, of keening, to the sounds of mourning where mourning had once again begun. You find me standing in salute at the grave of a leading man who proved that time and time was a kind of future. There I stand, and there I stand still, even though time will have its will be done for good, but more for ill. He was a man, shall we say, who from all the failing fallow views we'd seen, the old and vicious war, and all the civil storm and strife, the old and fractious factions, older, meaner, crueler, the barrenness of their divides. He was a man who found or tried to find a solution, salve. And in those fragile times, we felt a blessing, as a poet does in rhyme. We felt it far from perfect, sure, but passing to a better and to a more and more and more. Then one day he was killed, this man who'd helped to murder the old liturgies of murder our land had known so well. A bomb from underground sprung its terror trap, and a good man went up in flames, felled by the return, it seemed, of the same old vicious crap, violence of the mind and in the hat of a politics now graceless, northless. And so you find me standing at salute with tears like small and secret fears watering my face. Who knew what was next, when the leader of a nation might be swept away like this, when the grip that held the ways of a troop of different days in the calendar of sects, and the splintering within the splintering in splints, could be ungripped like this, and the hand left to flutter in the wind, and the nation in dehiscence now, in descent. It was as though a small mote of dust within just one of the salty tears rolling down my face surmised it all. As though the brine slipping from my eager eyes knew the future like the lie it would become, knowing well of the effort and the wiles of some unseen tyranny that was just gasping to begin. I cried and cried for the man, a friend. I cried and cried for the beginning of an end. When terror leads the way, my son, the path ahead is lit with flames, far from mellow embers, and far away from the dying of better days. From all this, I understood what happens to the good in a world that's made like this, a world of veils and shrouds, a world like our dear land of widow makers. Right, that's the first two chapters done. Let me find you a later chapter which has a bit more. Now we get into a bit more content of Lebanese content. This title is called In Hariri's Wake, 2005, and it dramatizes later in the chapter, like a typical cafe where the intelligentsia meet and discuss politics. So business people, journalists, that kind of group of people. Anyway, In Hariri's Wake. That was a little history, a waking dose for his dozing boy, dozing for so long. My father now resumed talk of the more modern room of the House of Lebanon. Fumes, in fact, fumes. My father now spoke to me of a pivot, of a turnstile, a kind of climacteric in the bitter wake of the passing of a well-loved leader. He set me a scene. A cafe where thoughts and dreams were discussed, a cafe of wide intelligence, where men of highest sense pursued the politics on the political scene, where talks and views in a parley like a quiet din of noise. In March of 2005, you see, there were two camps that split the Lebanese. On the 8th of March, in the wake of a murdered leader, Syria was the issue. On the 14th of March, in the wake of a murdered leader, Syria was the issue. The one group wished for a Syrian presence, the other for the swiftness, once again, of its due and binding absence. Syria, in short time, left. Later that year in summer, a new leader formed a new chance, a new term of hope in the wake of a murdered leader. And in this cafe, the politics, the acid quid pro quos were discussed from those who never followed anyone, putting their only trust in truths their eyes caressed. A group of doctors and of journalists, a group of business people, and of others whose vital interests in all their vitalness were triggered, piqued. So picture the scene, a smallish place, comfy and almost close to dingy, the lights low, and as though shadowed, and a few small trays of a few small plates, dishes of hot and cold mezze. Nearly all the group are toking on lit cigarettes. The smoke wafts in cooler curlicues, seeming to hold the elegance upon the dimly lit and naked air of the kind of sense and pizzazz that pondering intellectuals tend to gift the facets that seem and serenade high talk or low of the norms baroque, in Lebanese politics. One man said to another across the table, "The new government must do its best to exclude a likely president." Owen recently returned. His hunger for that place at the head of our republics, a kind of bleeding hunger we must fear. Never trust a man whose one sole goal flows with such adamant zeal. To allow him ingress might be at the last to beggar strife and scary trouble. That's what I think, and that's what I think, double. He slammed a fist upon the table. Another man, just as grizzled gray, a wiseacre like the first, opining in the melee, and in a different way, was heard to say above the clouds of smoke, a different form of wisdom, of a different form of warning. But don't you see, to exclude a man like this, a man who is, and justly is, the strongest Christian leader, is to make a move that is like a mind bathed in madness, the kind of move once made that proves a later, longer blade. By excluding a people's leader, a man as powerful as this, you force his hand. You force his hands, you force his arms into the waiting brace. In this way, you allow a place for Hezbollah, and in the following way. Now that Syria's gone, this one big and bulky group needs the help of such a man of the hour, someone just like this. And I predict the following. The people's most illustrious Christian leader, recently returned, will now arm himself on the forcing ground with the hurly-burly of the weaponed arms of Hezbollah. And in return, the party of God will, of course, duly earn a certain whiteness through and through, a certain lighted, licit way to stay a major broker in the layers of the Lebanese game. It was a simple scene of an exchange as simple as night and day, but its burden of significance was to set the light advancing, to illuminate the most basic paradox in Lebanese politics since the murder of a well-loved leader. My father was quick to speak of this exchange. It typified the topic, a pivot and a turnstile, whose turning was quick to still, and even later, worser nation. Okay. That's a few chapters, the 3 chapters from the opening part. I hope everyone's hearing me. Okay, yeah? Everyone
we hear
following?
you. We hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, part 2. War-Torn Tales. This has stories from Kana, 1996, from Kura during the Civil War, from Beisur during the Civil War, from other people who've in their own past and in the past they know have seen war-torn tales in Lebanon. So I'll read the first chapter of War-Torn Tales now and finish with the epilogue, which is the 2020 explosion. So, War-Torn Tales. Here's a man made livid by war well lived, living between dust and dun. A man who's seen the gift of youth gone tarred, the patterns of his life from youth to middle age, woven, you might say, by war's sad rage. Born, the year the Lebanese will never forgive, when civil strife went lit against the window of a nation, as though glass could burn, and did. His recollections prove now like a sieve, through which the acids of the riven bits and pieces, and the dross and the rotten rust and cuss of the wailing negative remain, drained of all the good that might have been. Picture here a boy of 7 years, for instance, lunch on a summer day, the sunlight halcyon, and all the ambience of laughter too, and all plainly golden, and all colored in the idiom of sweetness and of play. It's 1982. The war has gathered for 7 years its hateful collection of the dying and the dead. Now Israel, a towering neighbor, invades, filled with the intent to make from the ever crooked the further bent, bending in ways unheard of, even then, astride the wide fallenness of those dark-skinned days. And so the bombs parade their heartless, flaming laughter, their darkened smile, a grim rictus spread across the land, raiding with their cussing hands made of metal and made of fire. Immediately, the father of the house hurries all his flesh, all his blood, to the shelter forged beneath, and a home is now close to being unsheathed. And the boy at the center of this tale still hears, now an older man, the horrid rattle of bombs and of viscid battle, and one small aspect displays the worry of the well-worn way. His mother, in the rush of things, has left the stove alight, and, fearing now the hapless fire of her smallish mindless error more, and a little way beyond the bombs that hit and pit the ground, raining down the rain that has no name, like water, she begs his father to return back to the arms of flung and flying danger. And for a moment, it's as though the safety of a shelter turned by the stranger of untold war, a pittance less than the pity and the safety of home, sweet home. Years and years later, you find him a student there, a zealot for his studies. Each night, asleep by 10, each morning awake, fit and early, ruddy, ready to plow a beeline and working to get ahead, acing all his tests, so that his wide and long success seems like it pulses, aches, filled with such a brimming effort, a burly cause, to thicken on to good effects. There, at AUB one night in dorms, his roommate decides to gather by a grand and boyish invite a small group of friends for a card game. The hero at the heart of these shards of acid recollection feels pain to be made to sleep so late, spoiling the rest he feels he needs to be the ace-like ace he is. At the last, then, making it into the bower of his dreams, his sleep proves deep, deeper than the marrow of his bones. But then, stirred roughly from the elegant form of his slumbers at 4 a.m., being shaken and shook, to his droopy eyes filled with a sleepy look, he's informed in a slurry of hurried words that the blessed college hall at the beating heart of the campus down the way was now the horrid bitten child of a flaying bomb, the pride of a university now in smithereens. Shook and shaken, a young hero is not mistaken when he replies at that early budding hour, half wrapped still by cosseting sleep, that the hallowed building will still be broken, and like a broken thing, and of broken smithereens, later in the morning, when his sleep has sipped its full. And it's a response that's proved an icon of those times, when bombs were nothing strange, proffering their nightly naught, and pointing their fiery fingers, their zeros at a people made so hapless, hopeless by war. But then there's more to pin the poignance of the plot, like a poster on the wall, quick to shock and then estrange, a common held common sense in different lands, forlorn of war. In those times, to get some late night food, to slake or sate a young man's hunger was a mission, a marathon. Main gate, dorms gate were closed. It was midnight. The only way to leave the premises was by a long-haul trek, a burden on the haunches of even youth, whose evenness might turn to odd if made to traipse to the other end of campus, to the make of the medical gate. So what did the youths do when by fate fated for their food? Their target, a bakery, was open, and like an opening within the wee and chilly hours for the job of early leavening. The chosen pal, the choicest buddy, chosen to carry the orders of the many, would gather behind the nearby well-locked gate and shout for Abu Naji, and again for Abu Naji, chief and boss of all bakers, all bakeries, presiding spirit for the famished youth, bit now by a raving, ravenous hunger. The early morning of the bomb, whose dire last found language was when written in the smitten tongue of thoroughgoing night that split their college hall, making it a piece of the smattered ground. The chosen pal who was passing by missed his death by and by, a cold, thin hour. Had he taken a slightly later route to collect for his band of famished brothers and for sisters too, their late night food, the smithereens of the pride of AUB would have proved to the truth of his young life a lie. Okay, I'm going to read now finally the epilogue, which is about the 2020 explosion that happened obviously in Beirut. That was like, to those of you who know and those of you who may not, just like taking the piss by God, because the last straw that broke the camel's back, as if Lebanon didn't have enough problems, they had this explosion. So I'm going to read the epilogue now. 2020 explosion, so pity the nation. There were people on the streets, raising the tablets of the streets. They'd been tussling with pavements and squares for weeks and months, for nearly a year. A new page seemed on the brink of turning, if browned, dog-eared. Heartfelt complaint, long nourished, held close, found a new and sudden way to display its own hard-burned face. The sickening, sickening rust of decades of corruption and of the zealous frauds who'd made of Lebanon a well-lit nation of families like bastions, a land whose metal had endured like the soundness of the soundest of metals, a place now bereft of trust. All this now shown across the face of revolting peoples, rebels for the good. Spur and trigger. It was like a mere inch of former hurt now turned in larger spokes that had never and never and never been seen before, heard of. Wheels of dire utmost need now, as much as wheels of heartfelt resentment. Fighting voices were fighting, rejoicing. The streets came alive, visited in the flesh by so many ghosts. And there was hope for a while men and women fed each other the bread and the water of the living, livid streets, their own. But it was like a trite and scripted fate. At the forlorn middle of all this hail, of all this healthy commotion, the tipping of the long-born tide, a new devilment to destroy the hope of any new and homing hope, of any new and sunny morning for a nation whose demise was dawning. The Lebanese summer of 2020 exploded. Beirut proved a gutted wreck. Down by the port, a huge warehouse of chemicals caught fire, fused by the accident of some damned fool, or with the shark-like fin of some dark, wending intent. Records were smashed, gold medals were received, and gold after gold for tragedy. Lebanon went from lowest down to lower and lower and lower in the rungs of sickening schemes. Her fate, a terror-made cherry on top, a horror, a glottal stop, while the world looked on. Many died and many more were wounded. Half the city was crushed. And if all this had happened to the luxury of a lush or lusher country, it might have been enough for tears. But it was Lebanon, unloved yet again. And yet all the good grouped and clubbed together, all the true to heart, all the hearts rendered sure for others of the other hearts. But which way a revolution now, when the ones rebelling went wounded by the wealth, double spelt and double spelling of an event so long and wide and hard, it made a cripple of a cripple. The years will pass, of course, and their filler, the peopled human lives now forced to their last catastrophe, will also live. But torrents of briny weeping will ransack and replace the litany of all the litanies, of all the weathers, of all the fears, weathered far or near. For crying need cries the more and more the finished dead become the envied. Pity the nation, yes, pity. So that's my sample of reading. Hope that was okay, everyone.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us your little piece of patriotism in verse. So this has been lovely, and I can't wait to read it. So I'm pretty sure everybody else feels the same way.
I'll be sending you a copy, don't worry.
Thank you. I'll be waiting. And before I ask a question, I would like to see if anybody else here would like to give Omar a comment or ask Omar something about his book or the process of writing the book. So we're opening it for Q&A for the next 20 minutes. Isabel.
Hi, thank you. Omar, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I know a little bit about the 2020 tragedy because my daughter works a lot in Beirut and she had friends that were caught up in all of that. I also noticed the quite subtle rhymes in your work, which is really nice because I'm a big rhymer fan, and I know it's not
me too.
popular these days, but I think it makes a difference. I was just curious to know, do you also write in Arabic at all?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Okay.
I speak the lingo. I speak the lingo dialect relatively well and understand it, but my literary Arabic is crap.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, it takes me like 10 minutes to read a paragraph in a newspaper. I'm very weak in my Arabic, unfortunately.
Oh, that's okay.
And in a way, this book was a chance to actually learn a bit about my country. I had always kind of had it in the background of my head, but I never was immersed in Lebanese realities, you know, never lived them. So it was an opportunity to kind of close that gap a little bit, at least, you know.
It's always struck me as an outsider that Lebanon has always lived on the edge of absolutely everything, and has managed to survive by being fast on its feet, I suppose, you know.
This is a problem I pick up elsewhere in the book, that when you become so adaptive as the Lebanese are, because they are so adaptive, you forget the whole point that there are sometimes you shouldn't be adapting, you should be just complaining and saying, well, this shouldn't be the case at all. But the Lebanese have the knack of just getting on with things when in the worst circumstances, and they're doing themselves a disfavor. And for its 100 years, to my understanding, Lebanon has never been an actor. She's always been reacting, you know, whether it's the colonial powers or other, you know, powers kind of controlling bits of the political scene. She's never really been her own nation. There was a 10-year period I learned from my reading between about 1955 and 1965. That 10-year period, roughly speaking, was amazing in Lebanon. The rest has been crap. And as it happens, my father's generation, which is like the one I grew up with, you know, I saw all the men and the women and, you know, the adults in my childhood life, they all come from that 10-year period when Lebanon really was something special, and everything else has been the norm. What I always thought of as the norm was actually the fluke of 10 years, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Would anyone else like to say something to Omar? Omar, I have a question, actually a little comment. You know, it is very difficult to actually pin down the history, or let's say the truth in history, the political history of Lebanon, and of course, not just history, but up to today. It's very subjective. It depends on who you ask. It depends on which TV channel you watch. It depends on who belongs to who, or who believes in what. And I mean, how difficult was that to surpass, you know, the different, not just voices, but the different opinions, the different histories, the different truths and perceptions? And did you ever surpass it? Or was it a challenge for you to collect all those different opinions?
Well, I say in the two things. Firstly, there's an afterword, a sonnet called Lebanese TV Clutter, which takes a piss about how in Lebanon, if you watch the TV, they have commentators day and night, a treadmill of commentators, and not 1% changes. In London, you go on Newsnight as a minister and you make the smallest fib, tomorrow you're fired, and there's all over the newspapers. You know what I mean? Like, democracy is that bad in Lebanon. But I was going to say that because I don't have the experience or really my own kind of thoroughgoing view, I ended up just kind of gathering information from different people and different sources of very different kinds, and just representing them in a non-kind of, you know, I didn't try and unify them into one perspective. It was more like a documentary, like you'd go around interviewing certain people from different groups and different sects and so on. But I don't have the right to really impose a unity on it. I didn't have the right to do that. And you're right. I mean, Lebanon, the thing about Lebanon, unfortunately, for all the religion that's there, the overt religion, there's very little transcendence. I've never been in a place so zero-sum, you know, so competitive, so kind of difficult to live in a way which is healthy, because it is quite toxic after all they've suffered. And so for all the religion that's there, there's very little God, to be honest. The way I conceive of God is someone who can rise above eye for an eye and this and that, tit for tat. That's what I've always felt.
It's very challenging. I mean, what you did, it's pretty daring and challenging, actually, to collect the different stories. Yeah, because, you know, I mean, one person might say something that would completely contradict what the other person said.
Yeah, but that's fair
especially
enough. I
with
mean, it's
naming political figures. You know, when you name a political figure, one person could revere that figure, the other person could loathe him. And I say him
yeah, yeah,
because,
yeah.
you know, they're all men.
The majority of
Not
them
to
are he's.
generalize in a
Yes.
sexist manner, yeah, but yeah, I mean, bravo. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Well,
Because, you know,
I'm
up
not.
until
I'm not.
today, I mean, I don't know. I don't know anything. I mean, I don't have a clear vision on what happened in Lebanon and why, because I was also born in the 80s and I wasn't born in Lebanon. And it was, you know, I hadn't really experienced things except through the stories of others. And I hear so many contradictory stories. So it's just that, you know, you really don't know what happened. You
Yeah.
watch TV now, depending on what channel you're watching. Again, you don't know what's happening. You need to use your own
But
sense of judgment, and that's pretty difficult.
the thing is, I mean, it's a democracy in the sense that everyone cancels everyone out, but there's no real
Yeah,
functioning democracy there.
no,
Um,
no.
I mean, they used to be, as far as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong, but in the heyday of Lebanon, that period, the 50s and 60s, when there was a real chance, when Lebanon was flourishing in the way that we
Mm-hmm,
sometimes think of, I mean, nostalgically, there was a healthy
mm-hmm,
media. And the reason, and in one of the chapters in the book early on, I talk about how the reason why Lebanon is unique in the Arab world is because of the presence of the Christians. Without them and their relationship to the West and co-religionists, democracy would never have. And why has no democracy ever functioned in any healthy way across the Middle East, except for a small part of Lebanese history? Because of
mm-hmm.
the pivotal position of the Christians, actually. And that's not for or against, that's just a fact. That's the way things
Yeah,
happen.
yeah.
Um, and it makes it an interesting case because Lebanon, as I say, had so much potential. And to this day, I believe that the reason why global factors, kind of whoever you want to blame, created such tragedy in Lebanon from the 70s onwards was because Lebanon was seen as
Mm-hmm,
a threat. They were
mm-hmm.
people were jealous, geopolitically
Yeah,
jealous, like they were
mm-hmm,
so good at things that they were scaring everyone basically who weren't
mm-hmm,
necessarily in their camp. And so I think it
mm-hmm.
just provoked this turmoil that's been there for 50 years now, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, one thing I would say in a chapter I talk about from what's relating one person's story. In the Hariri days of like 95 to 2005, they thought that, and this would work in the West, they thought they could run Lebanon like a company, right? Improve the
Mm-hmm,
economy, get jobs, get stability, get money in the pockets, and then the identity politics of the sex will go away, right? You go
mm-hmm,
anywhere else in the West and you have a healthy economy, identity politics will be flushed out. In Lebanon, it runs
mm-hmm.
deeper than money. Even when the economy was
Uh-huh.
good, there was still this sectional allegiance. It runs so deep. It's beyond kind of economics, the way
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people, because people do think that if you can create jobs, people will be okay with their neighbor. But in Lebanon, it's never been
Mm-hmm.
that way. It runs in their
Yeah,
blood deep down somehow. I never
that's
understood it because I
right.
never lived it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a good point to make. Yeah, it's a really good point. Um, thank you, Omar. Anyone else would like to comment or ask a question? So, Omar, I also wanted to point out just ask a question actually. When you say Lebanon and the Arab world, do you mention Lebanon as an Arab country or as a country in the Levant? Because, you know, the term
That's it.
Arab is very tricky, you know?
Yeah. No,
There's
I've
Arabic
got two
speaking and there's
chapters
Arab,
in
which is
the
very different.
two chapters. Yeah, two chapters in the early part.
Yeah.
I talk about Lebanon, like the different myths of Lebanese, what it means to be Lebanese, from the
Uh-huh.
Phoenicians to the caliphates to pre-caliphates and so on. I try and get a little bit of
Mm.
historical background in there.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily, that was
Okay.
sourced from reading a couple of books. There's a book by Kamal Salibi called The House of Many Mansions, which is a
Uh-huh.
lovely, lovely book because it's a history of the second order. It's not a history of the politics and economics, which I got from other books like Trabulsi's book. It's a history of the
Mm.
concept of Lebanon, the history of the
Mm.
ideological concept of Lebanon, and the history of how
Mm-hmm.
that definition has changed. And
Mm-hmm.
it's also very interesting because it's you have parallel things elsewhere, like Englishness. What is Englishness? What is Irishness? There is this
Right.
debate about what Lebanon is. What is it? Is it Levantine? Is it Phoenician? Is it Mediterranean? Or is it Arab? What are these? And there's no one answer that collects it all. I don't think.
There's been much writing about the the interesting Levantine country called Lebanon, where people speak Arabic. I can think of one at the moment, Philippe Manstel. He wrote a book called The Levant or Levant, something like that. Philippe Mansel, French, but the book is written in English.
Right.
Yeah. So it's about, as you said, being Englishness, the language, again,
Well, I mean,
sometimes this can create confusion.
Well,
because we know, it's not an Arab country because Arab is a different culture. But it's the language, definitely. Not the native language of the land. Yeah.
Yeah, the language is something that unites Arab.
Thank you, Hedi.
Oh, sorry. Yes, please do ask. Yes.
She shared a link, a Philippe Mansel link from
Yeah,
The Guardian.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I made a comment in the chat.
I didn't see that. Sorry.
I found all the pieces to be beautiful and moving, and I thought the introduction with all these voices that were at the same time nostalgic, but like the dying voices, the dying father, and in some ways the dying son because of the dying nation. It's the theme of death that prefigures the apocalyptic ending. I call it apocalyptic because what else can you say when you need like 110 or more $1,000 Lebanese pounds for $1?
But I do call it The Cedar Never Dies because I think like in a personal life as in a national life, when you hit ground zero, you have two options: either you die, halas, there's no more to talk about, or you have to have hope. It's actually, paradoxically, it's when you're at your worst moment that hope becomes the only possible option. Otherwise, there's no point in talking. It's just dead. Halas.
No, your book instills hope. Your book itself.
Well, because what I'm trying to say, I say in the preface that the reason why there has to be hope is because all these witnesses have survived this horror, this unique horror that has gone through the Lebanese, and yet we're still alive. Can you imagine if in America or England they went through the things that we went through, or the Lebanese went through? Would they have been able to adapt as well? Because the Lebanese are heroic in that sense, and the poetry is mildly heroic as well, in the sense that it's narrative verse that is meant to be read aloud if possible, because I want it to have that epic, mildly epic feel to it. Sorry, Hedi, if I interrupt you. Sorry.
No, it was a pleasure, and again, as Isabel White mentioned, the language, the sounds, everything was really very enjoyable, very pleasurable. So this is all instilling. It's this contradiction or these polarities between death and resilience and life. I think you did a wonderful job.
The problem is people joke when I tell them the title, because I came up with the title before the 2020 explosion. So I give them the title and they say, well, no, it's dead. Or like with my previous poetry book, but it was an important failure. People reply, but it wasn't. There's always this split response. But Lebanon, I think, has no choice but to have some sort of hope, because, or at least meaning, if not hope. The fact that you can live through such horrors and still be, functioning in some ways is a good thing, is an admirable thing. But like I was saying to Isabel, the one problem with Lebanon, as far as I understand it, is that people adapt. They're almost too clever for their own good. There's a point where you should say, I don't want to adapt. Normatively, what's going on is full stop is wrong. And I don't want to, unfortunately, Lebanon, as far as I understand, Lebanon is not her own master. She has many different masters of different sorts. So it's never up to the Lebanese themselves, really. And even today, by the way, speaking to people who went to Lebanon over spring break, and when I was there in Christmas, you know, you walk around while you're saying 100,000 for $1, the 3% who have
People are living.
are going to restaurants and nightclubs, which is not a bad thing. It might even be good for the economy, but it does show you that, you know, if 95% of the population are suffering real harrows and 3% can drive C-class Mercedes or whatever it is and go to parties and spend money on caviar, it's not exactly a healthy state, I don't think, you know, in that situation. It doesn't look good, at least, I don't think. You know, I don't know if they're, I mean, that's why I think the idea of being a patriot, which I imbibed from my own dad, is healthy, because the Lebanese, in a way, need a way to rise above their, you know, economic or factional divisions. Whether it's going to have any prospect of doing anything is another story, because the moment the politicians in Lebanon are like, well, they're not doing anything, are they? They're just sitting around, I don't know, waiting for Godot. I don't know what the hell they're doing, to be honest. I mean.
Well, thank you for capturing this so beautifully, Omar.
No,
we're all
so
waiting for the book. It's been a great pleasure, and we look forward to hosting you again for Why Nots in the fall, hopefully this
Inshallah,
October.
yeah. I have a book of short stories coming out, which is I'm hoping will be a good book as well. I hope. Pieces published in the main between 2004 2022 being collected into one volume, and I have high hopes for that. So yeah, so thanks everyone. Really, thank you for attending, and thank you for listening, and thank you, Rilla, again for hosting me. It was lovely.
The pleasure, Omar. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here. So see you again soon.
Bye guys.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.